Today we're going to begin our discussion of the particular virtues of character that Aristotle considers, his list of 11 virtues. And to some extent, this list is organized from the ones that are more common, more familiar to us, less perhaps controversial as virtues, and also in a way with the ones that require more extensive discussion, or that perhaps in Aristotle's mind are more important, more prominent, being first in the list, and then requiring less discussion or less nuance or becoming less prominent as we go through the list, as we go down the list. So we're going to split this discussion up into two separate videos this week, this one and the following one. And this one, we're only going to discuss 3 out of the 11. And actually, the largest chunk of time will be discussing the virtue of bravery, which probably for Aristotle is the most important of the virtues of character. Bravery is defined as the mean that concerns feelings of fear and confidence. So we can record that here. Bravery, the mean of character, of course, as we know, that concerns fear and confidence. So this is our definition of bravery. The mean, or the, as we know what this means, the intermediate state between two extremes of excess and deficiency. So the mean or the intermediate state of the soul, of the character, that concerns fear and confidence. Now, fear and confidence are inverse notions. So one can translate talk of an abundance of fear into talk of lack of confidence. And talk of lack of fear can be translated into talk of abundance of confidence. So you can speak of this particular virtue either in terms of fear or in terms of confidence, although Aristotle seems to have a slight preference for speaking of it in terms of fear and the restraining and control of fear by reason, the training of fear or control of fear by reason. Thus, the first question is, what is the suitable object of fear? Aristotle defines fear as the expectation of something bad. And even though he also describes it in various places as a feeling, it's noteworthy here that it's not just a brute sensation. We all know about the feeling of fear, the hair standing up on end, the heart beating quickly, cold sweat running down the back of your neck, etc. So there's certainly a sensation, but it's not merely a brute sensation. In defining it as the expectation of something bad, Aristotle is separating out his view of fear from views that would view it purely as a kind of reaction, a response, a stimulus response. It's not just a brute sensation. It has a sort of representational or judgmental content. It's about something, which it seems it represents in a certain way. Fear represents something in a certain way. To fear something is to represent it in a certain way, as if making a judgment about its badness, for example, about the danger it poses. Thus, while Aristotle sees fear as belonging to the non-rational part of the soul, along with the appetites like hunger and thirst and the sex drive, this doesn't mean that it's not accessible in terms of rationality in some extended sense. Aristotle notes that we fear all bad things, from physical pain and death to friendlessness and loss of reputation. And the brave man is thought to be, in some sense, a fearless man. The brave man is the fearless man. That's the common opinion about the brave man. And to some extent, Aristotle will endorse this opinion but with qualifications. And the first is that not all fear is the concern of the brave man. Not all fear is the concern of the brave man. The brave man is not, for instance, the man who is fearless with respect to the loss of good reputation, because that is something that's good to fear. It's good to fear the loss of your good reputation. And this provides a clue for Aristotle as to what the specific type of fearlessness is that bravery involves. Bravery concerns fearlessness with respect to what it is bad to fear. So it's a mean that concerns fearlessness, but it is fearlessness with respect to what is bad to fear. So that's the first important qualification. Bravery concerns the mean with respect to fearlessness, but fearlessness with respect to what it is bad to fear. Or bravery, we could say, is a kind of fearlessness, but fearlessness only with respect to what it is bad to fear. Another qualification, though, concerns this notion of fearlessness itself. And it's useful, I think, to get this out on the table early on. Fearlessness is not the total absence of fear for Aristotle, but rather it's absence of the wrong amount of fear, or the wrong type of fear, or fear at the wrong time, or fear with respect to the wrong objects. So the fearless man will be without fear at the wrong time, or without fear with respect to the wrong objects, or without fear that is excessive in its amount. But it isn't going to be without fear, just simpliciter, or completely without fear. So this idea of there being a criterion of good or bad fear, this is really crucial to Aristotle's notion of bravery. And this raises the question, what's the criterion that separates what is bad to fear from what is good to fear? And Aristotle suggests that the criterion is that bad things that are not the result of vice or ourselves are bad to fear. Bad things that are not the result of vice or ourselves. So this is what is bad to fear. It's bad to fear things that are the result of vice or ourselves. Still, there are things that fall into this category that it's wrong to fear. Yet resistance to such fears will not make one brave necessarily. So this includes types of poverty or sickness. There are some types of poverty or sickness, of course, that are due to vice or ourselves. If you're poor because you've made some bad life choices, either some imprudent choices or criminal choices that resulted in you being poor. Similarly, you could be sick as the result of vice or yourself, because you, for example, allowed yourself to get addicted to drugs or something like that and develop certain conditions, or you rode your motorcycle without a helmet and just developed, brain damage or something like that. But of course, there are also cases in which things that result in poverty or sickness were not due to ourselves. We're not responsible for our poverty or our sickness, and these are bad things. But Aristotle is going to say that resistance to poverty or sickness typically is not the source of bravery. So to resist or keep under control your fear of poverty or your fear of sickness is not necessarily a form of bravery. This suggests that it's just a necessary and not a sufficient condition for bravery, that the fear of the brave person, or the fear rather that the brave person resists, concerns bad things that are not the result of vice or ourselves. So this I would say is this is necessary, not sufficient as a criterion of the fear that bravery concerns. So the fear that bravery concerns is indeed going to be the type of fear that concerns bad things that are not the result of vice or ourselves. But not everything that's not the result of vice or ourselves is going to be the fear with which bravery is concerned. Hopefully that's not overly complex, but if you just think of the example of, fearing poverty or sickness that's not the result of vice or ourselves, you might have that kind of fear under control in some sense. You might have it trained and responsive to reason such that it's not overwhelming your life. For example, in this time of the COVID pandemic, you're able to kind of soldier on with your life, even though you have a kind of fear of contracting the illness and something bad happening to you or your family. But is that bravery? Aristotle thinks not. And similarly with, the fear of poverty and so on. Overcoming that fear of poverty doesn't necessarily reflect bravery. I mean, using these terms like keep under control, keeping fear under control, or mastering it, or training it, and so on. So, but we'll try to get a little bit more precise about this a little bit later. But for now, we can just work with this rough language. So, around section 5, then in this chapter 6, where he first discusses bravery. Aristotle next gives some examples of the type of fear that escape the criterion of what is bad to fear. That, in other words, fears that don't fall under this criterion at all. And here, he gives examples like the fear of committing wanton aggression. The fear of committing wanton aggression. That's not a bad fear. If you fear that you're going to commit wanton aggression, that's a good fear to have. It's not virtuous not to have that fear or to have it under control. You should feel that fear. The fear of being envious is not a bad fear. Admittedly, these may seem like weird fears to have. But it seems like the main point Aristotle wants to make here is that bravery does not pertain to lack of fear in committing crimes or lack of fear of doing shameful things. So the person who's shameless, right? Or a person who's, as we say, a brazen criminal. This is a person that might be viewed from a certain perspective as analogous to the brave person because they seem to have a lack of fear or to have mastered or overcome whatever fear they might have of, for example, being convicted of a crime or being punished for a crime or doing something shameless and so forth. And this would include things like war crimes, like wanton aggression on children or women. Aristotle seems to have in mind here maybe the state of mind of kind of the average soldier in the ancient world who might fear that in the bloodlust following a victory in battle, they might do something later on that they're ashamed of, like committing wanton aggression against women and children, as so often happened in the wars in the ancient world. This is a more niche fear, perhaps, but even one that could be applicable today for people who are off in these wars in Central Asia and so on. But Aristotle's point here is that kind of fear doesn't fit the criterion of a fear that it's bad to have. So meeting your punishment with confidence, being a cocky, defiant criminal with a chip on your shoulder, for Aristotle is not in any way an admirable way to be. This isn't a good form of overcoming fear. To approach your flogging with quote unquote bravery. This for Aristotle would be a misuse of the term bravery. The kind of brazen criminal, or the criminal who's proud of being able to do hard time, isn't the kind of person that Aristotle would consider to be brave. And this brings up, I think, an important aspect of Aristotle's analysis of bravery. Bravery and a number of the other virtues as well, I think, but especially with bravery, Aristotle notes that it seems that some people are described as brave, but by analogy only. So, for instance, we might describe that criminal as brave by analogy. I think Aristotle would go so far as to say that's actually a mistake. That's a misuse of the term, an abuse of the term bravery, because that person's fear, lack of fear, or overcoming their fear isn't a good thing. They should have more fear of being shamefully punished and so forth. But there are other people that we describe as brave because they're analogous to bravery. And they didn't necessarily do anything wrong or shameful. So we might describe someone as brave in the face of, loss of wealth, bravely facing downturns in the stock market or whatever that eliminated the person's wealth. But this doesn't seem to be the paradigm of the brave person. It's only brave in an extended or analogous sense. And that's, I think, crucial to Aristotle's analysis, that if we want to, of all the virtues really, if we want to understand a virtue, first we should look for the paradigm case of that virtue, and not necessarily try to come up with some abstract definition that would cover anything and everything that someone might, in some sense, describe as virtuous in that way. In this case, that someone might, in any way, shape, or form, describe as brave. Rather, what we're looking for is the paradigm case of bravery. So even though, we might in a kind of analogous way describe someone who faces a loss of wealth or property with a kind of stiff upper lip as brave, or I think more commonly, we might describe a person as brave in the face of a long and painful illness. This, for Aristotle, would only be an instance of bravery in an extended or analogous sense. It's not the paradigm case of bravery. So this suggests that if we want to clarify the true nature of the virtue of bravery, we must do so by finding the paradigm case. So what is the paradigm case of bravery? He reasons that the paradigm case of bravery will be the case that exhibits bravery most of all. The paradigm case is the case that exhibits bravery most of all. And this case will be the one that concerns the greatest terror. The greatest terror. Since bravery, by definition, is concerned with the regulation of fear, then it suggests that the paradigm case of bravery will be the one that deals with fear in its purest form, with the greatest terror. So what's the greatest terror? He concludes that the greatest terror is death. He says, since it is a boundary, since when someone is dead, nothing seems to matter to them anymore. This is on in section 6, top of page 48. Death is most frightening of all, since it is a boundary. And when someone is dead, nothing beyond it seems either good or bad for him anymore. So that's narrowing the scope. We're dealing with bravery in the face of death. Of course, even here, in a way, you might think of sickness as a form of this kind of bravery in the face of illness as a form of bravery in the face of death, if the illness is a terminal illness. And there are also cases of bravery in the face of death When, for example, someone is caught during a storm at sea, to give one of Aristotle's examples. But these examples don't seem to him to be the paradigm. So we narrow it down to those cases in which we're regulating our fear in the face of death, which is the purest and the greatest form of fear. But not every case of that, not every case of facing death is going to be the paradigm case. In section 8, Aristotle concludes that the paradigm case for bravery will be bravery in the face of death in the finest conditions. In the finest conditions. So the paradigm case is bravery in the face of death in the finest conditions. And this involves bravery in war. Bravery in war. The danger of war, he says, is the finest danger. How does he prove this? Well, he says we find confirmation of this in the honors that are doled out for bravery by cities and monarchies. They bestow the greatest honors for bravery in war. Things like, the German Iron Cross, the Congressional Medal of Honor in the United States, and so on, are bestowed for bravery in war. In section 10 of chapter 6, he says, hence, someone is called fully brave if he is intrepid in facing a fine death and the immediate dangers that bring death. And this is above all true of the dangers of war. So if you're facing death when this is something that you're in an immediate risk for, when you put yourself out there in the midst of a battle and you're at the risk of immediate being killed, and you comport yourself in this way that Aristotle describes as finely, when you're behaving in a fine way. That's the paradigm case of bravery. So this leads to the first discussion question. Do you agree with Aristotle that bravery concerns only certain kinds of fears, and that its paradigm case is the resistance to fear that a soldier exhibits while fighting in a war? Why or why not? So that's the first discussion question once again. Do you agree with Aristotle that bravery concerns only certain kinds of fears, and that its paradigm case is the resistance to fear that a soldier exhibits while fighting in a war? Why or why not? Okay, so in chapter 7, Aristotle discusses the characteristic outlook of bravery. And it's notable for Aristotle that bravery has a characteristic domain, the domain of bravery. So we go back again to the kind of fear we're dealing with here. Of course, the domain of bravery is going to be fear. And we've already seen some things about this fear, that it's going to be the fear of something bad that is not up to or due to our own vices or our own actions, that concerns death paradigmatically, but other things as well. But paradigmatically, in the central case is going to be concerning death, and that we could have the opportunity to act either finely or shamefully in the face of. But he adds in chapter 7 this important qualification that restricts the scope of bravery to the scope of a human quality, a human virtue. I mentioned earlier that for Aristotle, bravery is not just simple fearlessness. That's not really a realistic possibility for human beings. Human beings have fear. You'd be a kind of alien if you were completely without fear, or there might be something wrong with you. Seems to be Aristotle's approach. If you completely had no fear, so we are going to have fear, and some fear is going to be so strong as to be irresistible. And he thinks that that kind of fear is just outside of the domain of bravery. Bravery is not concerned with irresistible fear. So an example of this would be a sudden, severe earthquake that caused you to just be frozen and petrified, clinging to whatever seems solid to you, and unable to think or to do anything. That wouldn't be a situation in which we would judge you to be behaving in a cowardly way or something like that, because there is such a thing as fear that is just irresistible. So the domain of bravery is limited to fear that is frightening, but not irresistible. Fear that is frightening but not irresistible. That's the domain of bravery. And so to say it's fear that's frightening might sound like a tautology, and it sort of is. But the point is that bravery has to, as it were, meet some kind of resistance. There has to be actually some real fear that rises to the level of being truly frightening, and that isn't just a kind of, neurosis or something like that, you might say. But it can't rise to the level of being totally irresistible, such that it just, any normal, sane human being would be petrified by this kind of fear. And so it's only in the cases of this kind of intermediate range of fearfulness that bravery has its domain. So fear is, for Aristotle, always going to vary in seriousness and degree. It's always going to be on a spectrum. There's going to be a range of the intensity of the fear. And the brave person is one who stands firm against things that are fearful but not irresistible. That's the brave person. The brave person stands firm against things that are fearful but not irresistible. It is not required, to repeat this point once again, because it's important, it's not required that the brave person be fearless. And here again, we remember that Aristotle regards the virtues of character as pertaining to the appetitive part of the soul, but the appetitive part of the soul insofar as this part of the soul responds to or listens to reason, or to the rational part of the soul, as to a father, Aristotle said earlier. You might recall that. So the virtues of character pertain to the appetitive part of the soul responding to reason as to a father. Hence, in the case of bravery, what's required to be brave is not an absence of fear, which is something beyond our human control, to cause to be the case. You're going to fear what you're going to fear. But rather, it's the responsiveness of fear to reason. So the brave person feels fear, but not in a way that overwhelms their reason or prevents reason from directing him to act in the right way or for the sake of the fine. Now, while Aristotle doesn't require bravery to eliminate fear, he does note that fear may be inordinate. So we can list ways in which the brave person may fall into one of the vices if they don't regulate their fear in the proper way. And so if the fear is inordinate fear, too much fear, or we may have the wrong kind of fear, or there may be fear at the wrong time, or fear may be directed toward the wrong objects. And you'll remember here the particulars of the action. And this is a reflection of Aristotle's general concern that the prudent person, the virtuous person, is the one whose actions and appetites and fear and confidence are calibrated to the particulars of the action. So these are some of the ways in which one may fail to strike the mean and therefore fail to attain bravery. Fear may be inordinate. There may be too much fear or of the wrong kind of fear. For example, this would include, having the bad sort of fear that we discussed earlier, or fear at the wrong time, or the wrong objects. Interestingly, these possibilities seem to be stock situations in comedy, such as being afraid of the wrong objects, like being terrified of a small animal, being afraid of a mouse or something like that is a stock situation in comedy. Or having the wrong kind of fear, like, for example, being afraid of getting your hair messed up. I mean, it is a bad thing to get your hair messed up or to lose your hair. And so, you might be afraid of that. But to be afraid of that during a storm at sea, that's the wrong kind of fear. I mean, it's appropriate to have fear when you're in the situation where you're suffering from a storm at sea, when the boat could capsize. But to be afraid of getting your hair messed up at that time is the wrong kind of fear at the wrong time. Or let's say being afraid of missing your favorite TV show because you're being arrested and booked on a serious charge. That's, again, having the wrong object at the wrong time, the wrong kind of fear. You should be afraid of, undergoing the shame of being convicted of a crime, not being afraid of missing your favorite TV show. But all these situations we find as comic, we would find as comic. Someone's being taken away in handcuffs and they complain that they're going to miss their favorite TV show. I mean, it's meant to be, it's not very funny. Don't get me wrong here. But the point is that it seems like this kind of inappropriate fear seems to be tied to comedy. So you can think about why that might be. But at any rate, it's clear that the point that Aristotle wants to make is that we need to calibrate our fear in the right way so as to avoid inordinate fear that's of the wrong kind at the wrong time or with the wrong objects, if we are to be a truly brave person. He says in section 5 there, in chapter 7, hence, whoever stands firm against the right things and fears the right things for the right end in the right way at the right time and is correspondingly confident is the brave person. For the brave person's actions and feelings accord with what something is worth and follow what reason prescribes. They follow what reason prescribes. So the brave person's feelings of fear, although very real, will not, it seems, be inordinate. They won't be feeling too much fear, and nor will their fear be misdirected or mistimed in the ways we've just been talking about. Hence, the characteristic of the brave person is not so much to have self-control in the face of fear, but rather to have trained his fear, we might say, or I sometimes use this word regulated his fear, so that it doesn't exceed what is fine and right, or react to inappropriate objects. The fear is kind of like an unruly pet animal that you have to obedience train in order to keep it somewhat regulated and behaving in the way you want it to behave. So that's the characteristic of the virtuous person, is to have regulated this non-rational part of the soul in such a way that it doesn't overwhelm reason, but rather that it takes its cue from reason and accepts guidance from reason. So it's not quite self-control, but rather a matter of the person who's developed or trained their fear so that it is manageable. And of course, that can be undone if the object is so terrible or terrifying that it just overwhelms whatever measures you've taken to regulate your fear, as in the case of an earthquake or, Godzilla decides to visit your city and start destroying downtown or whatever. I mean, in those situations, there's nothing you're going to do. You're going to scream and yell and run. So the Aristotle seems much more concerned with these everyday situations and the brave person training and regulating their fear or their confidence. Again, you can go from either direction, but regulating it in such a way that their fear is never triggered by something that shouldn't cause fear, like a mouse, or by too much fear, like a poisonous snake. That's also something bad to be feared, a poisonous snake. But a poisonous snake is loose in your house. I mean, that's something that you should fear. But you shouldn't hide in the closet and cower, and there shouldn't be inordinate fear at that. So the person who's brave is not the person who feels no fear at a poisonous snake being loose in the house, but who basically can, as it were, keep his head, because his fear is not going to be totally overwhelming. Nor will his fear be aroused at an inappropriate time, like being afraid of illness or death if you're a healthy young person who's in no immediate physical danger. So having that kind of constitution where your fear sort of naturally more or less fits into the mold that reason prescribes as being the proper limits of your fear. That's the idea. In section 6, he describes the brave person aiming at the fine in performing brave actions. And we've already read some descriptions of this, but again, now to the brave person, bravery is fine. Hence, the end it aims at is also fine, since each thing is defined by its end. The brave person then aims at the fine when he stands firm and acts in accordance with bravery. Clearly, this is a conscious aim. The brave person performs a brave action because it seems like the fine thing to do, or a fine thing to do. I mean, depending on the situation, it may be that the only fine thing to do in this situation would be to perform a brave action. Anything else would be cowardly. But at any rate, the brave person is always aiming at doing the action that is a fine action. We see that bravery here, although it may have its paradigm case in the heat of battle, for Aristotle is never something that is impulsive or reflexive or automatic. It's not an automatic response. It's not a reflex response. Rather, it's a deliberative one that wishes for something that appears good and takes the finest means to achieve that thing that it consciously aims at. Now, the opposite of the brave person is the rash person. Rashness is a vice because it goes to one of the extremes that the brave person avoids. Since bravery can be characterized either in terms of having the right amount of fear or alternatively the right amount of confidence, rashness can be characterized as either a vice of excess of confidence or of deficiency of fear. Aristotle characterizes rash people in kind of a peculiar way. He says that the rash person imitates the brave person, but that most are rash cowards. In other words, he doesn't seem to believe that most rash people really have less fear or more confidence than brave people. Instead, they're cowards whose fear and confidence is not properly trained, and so they cannot rely on reason to guide them. Instead, they imitate the brave person who can. Aristotle seems to believe that the extreme of rashness is fairly rare, and that most cases of apparently rash behavior are actually a form of, this is an Aristotle's word, but I think it accurately describes what he has in mind. Most cases of rash behavior are a form of what modern psychologists would call overcompensation for cowardice. And this judgment may be rooted in his view that was stated back at the end of Book 2, his view that at least some virtues, including bravery, are more opposed to one extreme than the other. And this is actually the case in both of the first two virtues, in the case of bravery and also in the case of temperance. Both of these virtues are more opposed to one of the two extremes that they're joined with than the other. Aristotle notes that it's not always the case that the mean is equidistant from the two extremes. This is in Book 2, Chapter 8, back at the end of Book 2. In some cases, one or the other extreme may simply be closer to the mean than the other. And this can be either because of the nature of the object or because of something in us. In that chapter from back in Book 2, Aristotle actually cited the vice of rashness as an example. Rashness is closer to bravery than cowardice is. Bravery is more the direct opposite of cowardice than of rashness. In other cases, individual human beings have a natural tendency, that makes them closer to one extreme than the other. That is, it makes them naturally more prone to offending against the mean in that direction rather than the other. But if rashness is closer to bravery, then it's also the case that we have a greater tendency to offend on the side of cowardice than on the side of rashness. In chapter 9 of Book 2, Aristotle explained what we should do in those cases in which we find ourselves in a situation in which there's either an objective or a subjective tendency to one extreme over the other. He says we should lean toward the contrary extreme, even aiming more at the contrary extreme than at the mean itself. So, for example, a person with a known personal tendency to intemperance, and intemperance in drink, for example, might become a teetotaler at the risk of appearing insensible in order to hit the mean of temperance. So leaning the prudent strategy, when you know that you have a tendency towards one extreme rather than the other, is to lean towards the opposite extreme. Likewise, since we have a greater objective tendency to cowardice than to rashness, it stands to reason that the cowardly person, whose fear and confidence have not been made appropriately responsive to reason, in the way we've just been talking about, is the case in the brave person, that this person whose fear and confidence have not been made appropriately responsive to reason might overcompensate and lean too far onto the side of fearless behavior, even trying to outdo the brave person, and thereby become rash. So this is the idea that the cowardly person can sometimes become an overcompensating cowardly person and thereby become a rash person, doing things that the brave person wouldn't do because they're not prudent things to do. They show a deficiency of fear and excess of confidence. You could think here, for example, of Theon Greyjoy, any of you Game of Thrones fans, who decided he was going to take over Winterfell as a paradigm example of a rash action, which he didn't do because he was braver than, say his sister, but because he was really at heart kind of cowardly or lacking confidence, and so he overcompensated with very negative results for him. The coward who experiences an untrained capacity for fear that tends toward an excess of fear, or fear directed toward the wrong object at the wrong times and the like, is, Aristotle says, of a despairing sort. Of a despairing sort. So when your fear is improperly regulated, this naturally leads you to become a despairing sort of person. One thinks here of the anxious person who's constantly worrying about money or his health or the political situation or what have you. And such anxiety usually leads to a corresponding state of depression. By contrast, the brave person whose fear and confidence are trained to stay within the boundaries set by reason is free to be hopeful about the future. This is, I think, one indication, and we'll see a parallel indication in his discussion of temperance, whereby Aristotle is trying to draw the connection with happiness, the happy life. That even though it might seem like bravery is kind of this necessary evil, because after all, it would be better, we think, that if we didn't have to face bad things. It would be better if we didn't have to face death and danger and these sorts of things. But since we do, I suppose it's finer to be brave than to be a coward. But in itself, it doesn't seem like there's anything all that good about bravery. But Aristotle is trying to show how bravery can be integrated into the flourishing life the life well lived. The brave person is the person whose fear and confidence are trained to stay manageable, to stay within boundaries set by reason. And that person is free to be hopeful about the future. And think of the contrast case of the cowardly person who's constantly afraid of things, whose fear has run amok. That person is likely to be of a despairing sort, become depressed and so forth. Next, Aristotle lists 5 conditions that resemble bravery, but that are distinct from it. This reminds us of a problem endemic to the pursuit of the virtues of character, namely that they're susceptible of being imitated and they're vulnerable to being mistaken for other things. So the 5 conditions that resemble bravery are as follows. The first he calls the Bravery of Citizens, and this is sometimes called in the literature on Aristotle Civic Courage, and I'll use that term. You can see the etymological similarity there. But I don't know, this trips off the tongue better than the Bravery of Citizens, and I think sort of captures the idea better, at least to my ear. So the first is this thing called Civic Courage. What is this? Bravery and civic courage are very close to each other. The main difference is going to be motive. The person with civic courage asks for the sake of basically carrots and sticks that are extrinsic to the action itself. So for the sake of receiving honors and avoiding public shame would be the paradigm example. So the person with civic courage is going to act in the same way as the brave person, but they do so because they want to be honored or they want to avoid the shame of having the stigma of being considered a coward. And that's why they act. Whereas the brave person acts for the sake of the fine. Hence, the crucial test that's going to separate out the brave person from the person with civic courage is going to be when the act will not be seen or recognized. That's when we see that this form of civic courage is not the same thing as bravery. When the act is not seen or recognized, the person who has mere civic courage has no more motive to do the action. And so they're going to diverge. The person with mere civic courage is not going to do a brave action if there's no chance that they're going to get recognized for it. And also, they have no qualms about performing a shameful action if no one's going to see it, no one's going to know about it. Whereas the brave person would feel, as it were, they couldn't live with themselves if they did a shameful action, even if no one saw it. And they would want to do a fine action just for the sake of its fineness, whether or not it was recognized or honored by anyone. So that's the difference between the person with civic courage and the person who's truly brave. Also included in this category, Aristotle says, as a kind of subcategory. And of course, here we're in chapter 8 now. He describes this as also belonging to the class, those who are compelled by their superiors. So we have lots of cases in history. A famous one is Stalin, Joseph Stalin, during the battle at Stalingrad beginning at that time, and then I think pretty much continuing for the war, compelled the Soviet soldiers to stand firm, and they would be executed if they retreated. This is dramatized if anyone has seen the movie with Jude Law called Enemy at the Gates. In an early scene, this is dramatized where it showed the soldiers who were trying to retreat end up being fired upon and killed by their own commissars. So you have cases of this sort of thing too. And that's a kind of civic courage. The person here is motivated by the stick rather than the carrot, but it's the same kind of idea. Is that these people would have retreated, but as Stalin said, you have to be a very brave soldier to be a coward in my army, or something to that effect. The second is when a person acts with confidence because they have experience of the situation. We can call this experienced confidence. So Aristotle cites the fact of there are many groundless alarms in war. And those who know this, who have the experience, will, not get very agitated by an alarm in war. I recall an episode of the series Band of Brothers when a replacement soldier comes in to Easy Company, which is the main subject of the HBO series Band of Brothers, and hits the deck when a shell flies overhead. But the sergeant that's sort of introducing him to the lay of the land, so to speak, in the particular section of the line that these soldiers are occupying, doesn't even flinch. And that might look like this sergeant is so brave, so courageous, whereas this new replacement soldier is a coward. But Aristotle would say, well, that's just an illusion, because that person has a kind of experienced confidence, or confidence based in experience. Another example of this would be when a soldier or a boxer or MMA fighter has more confidence because he knows he has better skills or weapons. So, a German Tiger tank charging 3 Sherman tanks on a World War II battlefield might have looked brave to someone who had no knowledge of the differences between a Tiger tank and a Sherman tank. But you realize that the superiority of the Tiger tank makes this not an act of bravery at all. And the tank commander who knows the superiority of his Tiger knows that he can easily take on 3 Shermans, no problem. So again, the crucial test is the thing. Put the Tiger tank commander in a medium-sized Panzer tank facing a Soviet T-34, would he behave the same, or would he run? Aristotle also notes that professional soldiers turn out to be cowards whenever danger overstrains them. So professional soldiers can seem brave just because they've got so much experience of battle, but they're also, when they hit the breaking point, they're also the first to completely skedaddle and run en route. As Stannis Baratheon said in Game of Thrones, those damned sellswords, when they were moving on Winterfell, and his hired professional soldiers deserted him when it became clear that things weren't going their way. Okay, so that's experienced confidence. The third is spirit, that can look like courage or resemble bravery. Spirit, this is the Greek word thumos. And this is typically connected to pride and rage. The part of the soul that's responsible for, you might say, having a temper. Especially the kind of temper that results when someone feels like they've got a thin skin and, their ego's been bruised, and so they just burst out in a rage. This I would just say is typically the simulacrum, or the substitute for courage that is found in the mafioso. This is like typical of a Joe Pesci character in a Martin Scorsese film. So provoked by wounded pride, by anger and a lust for revenge, the person does something that appears to be courageous. It typically will be something rash. And people will say, well, he's got a temper on him. He's hot-blooded. This person charges off, and he's so carried away by his temper that he loses his head and forgets to be afraid of the consequences. And for Aristotle, this is not bravery. This is a species of rashness that's rooted in a kind of animalistic nature that hasn't been tamed by reason. So when Joe Pesci's character kills Billy Bats in a feat of rage in Goodfellas, this is a totally imprudent move, which eventually gets him whacked, which he did purely because of his temper. Like that's spirit, and it may look like a courageous move to, well, we're just going to kill a made man just because we feel like it. But this isn't real true bravery. It's just something that resembles bravery. Aristotle connects this to the fight or flight reflex in an animal. So it's not true courage because it doesn't even rise to the level of human excellence. It's something that we share in common with animals, although maybe without the dimension of sensitivity to pride, which doesn't seem like something animals have. Let's look at number 11. section 11, page 51. Now, brave people act because of the fine, and their spirit cooperates with them. But beasts act because of pain, for they attack only because they have been wounded or frightened, since they keep away from us in a forest. They are not brave then, since distress and spirit drives them in an impulsive rush to meet danger, foreseeing none of the terrifying prospects. So, in other words, this is just like the animal who, will attack, even attack a larger animal, which looks like bravery, but it's not, because again, you have the crucial test. If they were in a situation where they could flee, they would flee. It's not bravery. Remember, bravery also involves this discernment of the particulars of the action. And so a person who has a temper in this way is least able to make such discernment. Then finally, there are two final conditions, and they're kind of, in a way, complements of each other. Hopefulness and ignorance. And in both of these, hopefulness and ignorance, there's a kind of controlling illusion or delusion that accounts for the resemblance to bravery. So hopeful people, we might call this overconfidence in some contexts. This is what you might see with a boxer or a general who's had many victories and who takes risks that would have prompted fear if they'd not been blinded by hope. So there's this illusion sort of blinding them that victory is going to come easy to them because it's come so easy before, so many times before. This is like Rocky when he loses to Clubber Lang. Or to take a real-life example, maybe General Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg, when he orders Pickett's charge, or when he orders his army to strike the Union Army when the Union Army has a superior entrenched position on the high ground. It's a kind of hopefulness that looks like bravery, but really it's just a kind of delusion that's created by overconfidence. And then there's ignorant people, people who are too stupid to be afraid, who don't appreciate the threat they're facing. And so they too are blinded, but they're blinded in a kind of negative sense. It's not that they have something blinding them, like a picture of hopeful outcome that's blinding them, but rather they just lack information. So that's why I said that hopefulness and ignorance seem like they're two sides of the same coin. Finally, Aristotle remarks that although bravery concerns feelings of both confidence and fear, it's really in regard to fear that bravery is most concerned. That is, we consider those persons to be brave who are resistant to things that cause fear more than we do to those who are susceptible to things that cause confidence. Bravery, in other words, has more to do with enduring pain than anything. It would seem to be, for that reason, an uneasy fit within Aristotle's general schema, which says that the virtuous person takes pleasure in performing virtuous actions. So what pleasure is there in performing a brave action when it seems like bravery is just about enduring pain? Now, while it may appear that brave actions have nothing pleasant about them, Aristotle compares them to the actions of a boxer who endures blows for the sake of the prize. The boxer presumably doesn't like the blows, but he enjoys boxing. Why? Well, the answer is similar in the case of the brave person. The brave person doesn't take pleasure in experiencing fear. That's always painful. However, he does take pleasure in the knowledge of the fineness of his actions, which, of course, what makes his action fine is the presence of this fear. So the fear is kind of inseparable from the overall experience, but the knowledge of the fineness of the action creates a kind of overriding self-confidence or contentment with oneself that overrides the fear, the pain of the fear that has to be endured. So he says, this is on page 53. 52 rather, to the top of, very bottom of 52 to the top of 53. As we said then, standing firm against what is painful makes us call people brave. That is why bravery is both painful and justly praised, since it is harder to stand firm against something painful than to refrain from something pleasant. Nonetheless, the end that bravery aims at seems to be pleasant, although obscured by its surroundings. This is what happens in athletic contests. For boxers find that the end they aim at, the crown and the honors, is pleasant, but being made of flesh and blood, they find it distressing and painful to take the punches and bear all the hard work, because there are so many of these painful things. The end being small appears to have nothing pleasant in it. And so if the same is true for bravery, the brave person will find death and wounds painful and suffer them willingly, but he will endure them because that is fine, or because the failure is shameful. So the point is, just as the endurance of blows and taking punishment, even though it's not pleasant in itself, is pleasant in a higher sense, and that it becomes the source ultimately of the sense of having accomplished something. In the case of the boxer, so too in the case of the brave person, they are aware of the fineness of the way in which they're enduring and this experience of fear and the pain of it, and this makes their life better overall. So he says the brave people are the ones who most of all value life. For this sort of person, more than anyone, finds it worthwhile to be alive and knows he is being deprived of the greatest goods, and this is painful. But he is no less brave for all that. Presumably, indeed, he is all the braver, because he chooses what is fine in war at the cost of all these goods. So he makes a distinction here that ends here that's also worth noting, that it's not true, he says, in the case of every virtue, its active exercise is pleasant. The active exercise of bravery isn't pleasant, but bravery is pleasant only insofar as we attain the end. If we attain the end of bravery, we make it through the battle without having left our post or done something shameful, then we are contented with ourselves, and we've experienced the value of life, and we are going to experience a pleasure in the fineness of our action and our character that results. Okay, that's bravery. And we'll be able to cover temperance and generosity more quickly. Temperance is a virtue that's a mean with respect to the pleasures of the body. This is the definition of temperance. But we have to immediately say, which pleasures of the body? Because for Aristotle, it's not going to be just any pleasures of the body that temperance pertains to. Now, first we might note that, well, for Aristotle, there are non-bodily pleasures of the soul. Temperance doesn't concern these. It only concerns bodily pleasures. So what does Aristotle regard as a bodily pleasure? One might think that this is simply a pleasure that's derived from one of the 5 bodily senses, but that would be mistaken. Not all the pleasures of the senses admit of a temperate or intemperate enjoyment. So Aristotle writes in page 54 here, those who find enjoyment in objects, sorry, this is the top of the page there, in section 3, second sentence. For those who find enjoyment in objects of sight, such as colors, shapes, a painting, are called neither temperate nor intemperate, even though it would also seem possible to enjoy these either rightly or excessively or deficiently. The same is true of hearing. No one is ever called intemperate for excessive enjoyment of songs or play acting, or temperate for the right enjoyment of them. Nor is this said about someone enjoying smells, except coincidentally. For someone is called intemperate not for enjoying the smell of apples or roses or incense, but rather for enjoying the smell of perfumes or cooked delicacies. For these are the smells an intemperate person enjoys because they remind him of the objects of his appetite. So, Aristotle notes that the pleasures of sight and sound and smell, when these pleasures are enjoyed for their own sake, not as a kind of appetizer. That's what Aristotle is referring to here. So, when you're enjoying the smell, even of food, just because of its lovely aroma and not because it's causing you to salivate, or when you enjoy the smell of a perfume just because of its intrinsic qualities and not as a kind of aphrodisiac. That's what he's referring to there. So when you're enjoying this pleasures of sight and sound and smell for their own sake, these seem to be distinctively human modes of enjoyment. Aristotle notes in section 7 there that the other animals don't seem to find pleasure in these things, except coincidentally. What a hound enjoys, for instance, is not the smell of a hare, but eating it. But the hare's smell made the hound perceive it. What a lion enjoys is not the sound of an ox, but eating it. But since the ox's sound made the lion perceive it was near, the lion appears to enjoy a sound. So pleasures in what would later become known as aesthetic pleasures, aesthetic perceptions, are distinctively human, Aristotle seems to be saying. And here he's anticipating the view of Immanuel Kant and others, that there are pleasures that are rooted in the body, but when there are pleasures in these so-called higher senses of sight and sound, and to some extent smell, and also even taste, as we'll see in a minute, these are pleasures that seem to not fall under the domain of temperance. Temperance concerns only those bodily pleasures that we share with the animals, the bestial pleasures of touch and taste. So, that's the first answer to this question. Which are the pleasures of the body? The pleasures of touch and taste. But even not all of these fall under the domain of temperance. Aristotle mentions the pleasures of rubbing and warming in the gym, essentially. In other words, the pleasures that come from healthy physical exertion, the preparation for such exertion and aftercare. These are not things that temperance concerns. And even in the pleasures of taste, when this includes things like wine tastings or gourmet food savorings and small plates and such, it's not a matter that temperance has to concern itself with. So more specifically, temperance includes, you might say, eating like an animal. And that's when touch and taste are like an animal. That's when temperance comes into play. Just to summarize the point he seems to want to make. So eating to sate one's hunger. That's what temperance is concerned with, that kind of eating. Not eating in a kind of aesthetic way. Drinking to enjoy inebriation. That's what temperance is concerned with. Or the pleasures of sex. Not just exercise. That's what temperance is concerned with. In the case of temperance, it's clearly quantitative overindulgence, the too much that's at issue. While there is a vice of deficiency, which Aristotle calls being insensible. Remember from his original list, he calls this a rare possibility, but nonetheless, it would be the vice of deficiency, being insensible. It's so rare, it's hardly worth mentioning. Aristotle calls it here, page 56 in section 7, he says, this sort of insensibility is not human. If someone finds nothing pleasant or preferable to nothing, he is far from being human. So he coins this term being insensible as a vice of deficiency concerning these pleasures with respect to the body. but it's so rare that it doesn't even have a name. Now, in our day, we seem to be more conscious of eating disorders, for example, but we medicalize these rather than moralize them. How would anorexia and bulimia, for example, be viewed by Aristotle, one wonders? Certainly, if someone took no pleasure in any kind of food or drink, we would suspect a medical problem of some sort, perhaps depression, for example. But certainly a lack of interest in the pleasures of touch and taste that has no medical explanation would seem to be a very, very rare thing and indeed hardly human. So instead, temperance has primarily to do with avoiding excess in food and drink. As we see, Aristotle describes in section 3 on page 55, eating indiscriminately or drinking until we are too full is exceeding the quantity that accords with nature. For the object of natural appetite is the filling of a lack. That is why these people are called gluttons, showing that they glut their bellies past what is right. Aristotle notes that there's here not just a generic appetite for food, drink, or sex. There are also specific manifestations of the generic appetite when it becomes an appetite for a specific kind of food or drink or sex. Hence, temperance is not just a matter of a generic, across-the-board, one-size-fits-all moderation in the intake of food and drink and sexual activity. Rather, it involves eating the right kinds of foods at appropriate times in the right amount relative to that kind of food and so forth. What is intemperate to eat at Thanksgiving is not the same as what it's intemperate to eat as a midday snack. The amount of chocolate that it's intemperate to eat, let's say in ounces, is not the same number of ounces as the amount of spinach that it's intemperate to eat. Drinking 6 adult beverages on a Friday night when celebrating a promotion is not intemperate. But drinking 6 such beverages with breakfast on Monday morning is. And eating deep-fried butter on a stick, a staple of many state fairs in the United States, that's intemperate at any time, anywhere, in any amount, and so on. So, as with bravery, the true mark of possessing the virtue is the training of the appetites to listen to reason. The temperate person is not the person who's able to white-knuckle it and successfully resist their powerful urge to have a second slice of chocolate cake for dessert. Rather, the temperate person is the person who feels no particular pain at limiting himself to an appropriate portion of dessert. Temperance is in no way a rejection of pleasure. To be temperate is not to practice self-denial or asceticism. I think the word temperance has been ruined by the temperance movement of the 19th and early 20th century that led to prohibition in the United States, that promoted teetotaling, which suggests that temperate means to just totally reject something. And that's not the sense of temperance here. Instead, temperance is indulging in pleasures in a way so as to guarantee the best and happiest life. That's what it is. So temperance has this outlook. Section 8, page 56. The temperate person has an intermediate state in relation to these bodily pleasures, for he finds no pleasure in what most pleases the intemperate person, but finds it disagreeable. He finds no pleasure at all in the wrong things. He finds no intense pleasure in any bodily pleasures, suffers no pain in their absence, and has no appetite for them, or only moderate appetite, not to the wrong degree or at the wrong time or anything else at all of that sort. If something is pleasant and conducive to health or fitness, he will desire this moderately and in the right way, and he will desire in the same way anything else that is pleasant. If it is no obstacle to health and fitness, does not deviate from the fine, and does not exceed his means. For the opposite sort of person likes these pleasures more than they are worth. That is not the temperate person's character, but he likes them, as correct reason describes. So the temperate person described here is happy because he benefits from an equanimous and peaceful state of mind that's not riven or split apart by the appetites. He's not distracted by thinking about sex all the time or by imagining what he's going to have for dinner 15 minutes after he eats lunch. The temperate person is thereby able to enjoy life more, including the pleasures of eating, drinking, and sex. Now, on intemperance, Aristotle reserves a harsher moral judgment for the intemperate person than for the coward. Intemperance concerns pleasure rather than fear, and this, Aristotle thinks, is more in our control. Fighting pleasure, so to speak, is easier than fighting pains, like fear. Or you might say training pleasure, regulating pleasure is easier than regulating pains like fear. And so it should be, in principle, easier to acquire the habits of temperance than bravery. There's also something infantile about being intemperate, which reminds us of the behavior of small children. Wah, I want another piece of cake. An intemperate adult, Aristotle seems to think, is like someone who hasn't quite grown up. There's a distinctive sort of contempt that such a person earns in our eyes. Someone who's still behaving as an overindulgent child as an adult. So this leads to a second discussion question. Aristotle evaluates intemperance from a moralistic perspective. Those who habitually indulge in food, alcohol, or sex in an excessive manner are regarded by him as shameless individuals who have a vicious character. In the last century or so, Western culture has increasingly moved away from this moral concept of intemperance in favor of a medicalized view of such habits. We now speak of eating disorders, food addiction, alcoholism, and even sex addiction. Does this mean that Aristotle was wrong to have viewed intemperance as a vice? Or is there still a role for a moral conception of excessive appetite indulgence? Why or why not? So I'll read that once again, kind of a long one, but the basic idea is pretty simple, straightforward. Aristotle evaluates intemperance from a moralistic perspective. Those who habitually indulge in food, alcohol, or sex in an excessive manner are regarded by him as shameful individuals who have a vicious character. In the last century or so, Western culture has increasingly moved away from this moral concept of intemperance in favor of a medicalized view of such habits. We now speak of eating disorders, food addiction, alcoholism, even sex addiction. Does this mean that Aristotle was wrong to have viewed intemperance as a vice? Or is there still a role for a moral conception of excessive appetite indulgence? Why or why not? Okay, so at the beginning of this video, I said we'd talk about generosity. And I don't have a lot to say about generosity. It's more straightforward, I think. But since we're running low on time, I think what I will do is cut this video off now, and we'll pick up with generosity and the rest of Aristotle's list of virtues next time.